This is a war on the rule of law. Young people who are coming up today, they're not responsible for the world that is allowing them to get away with these things. Rather, these things are now permissible in our society because of decisions being made by older people. We had a presidential candidate by the name of Donald Trump in 2024 who made it very clear that enforcing the immigration laws would be a top priority. And indeed, it was a priority that the voters who put Donald Trump back in office in 2024 expected him to carry out. Well, now you have cadres of left-wing activists in cities like Minneapolis who are trying to frustrate the will of the American people, who are basically attacking American democracy. They are attacking the rule of law, and they're trying to restore us to an anarchic, open borders situation that we had under Joe Biden. Six years ago, America was plunged into a summer of rioting by an incident that happened in Minneapolis. This year, we have another incident in Minneapolis which threatens to do much the same thing that the killing of George Floyd did 6 years ago. Now, we don't yet have a series of riots as a result of the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis by an ICE agent. What happened was that Renee Good and her wife were involved in anti-ICE activities. They were basically following ICE agents around. They had been trained in terms of intervening to try to prevent ICE from doing its job, from arresting illegal immigrants. They were carrying whistles, which they used to alert illegal immigrants to the approach of ICE. Anyway, these activists were involved with ICE in Minneapolis. They got stopped. They were being interviewed by ICE. You had agents talking to them in their car. And then Good and her wife decided that they were going to drive forward while there was an ICE agent standing directly in front of their vehicle. As a result, the car lurched forward, it hit the agent fired, and Renee Good was killed. Now, we have not had, again, as I say, riots quite yet breaking out as a result of this, but there has been an uptick in so-called protests in places like Minneapolis and indeed all around the country that are targeting ICE, that are complaining about ICE, that say that ICE should be abolished. ICE, of course, is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. And all of this is a flashback to what we experienced 6 years ago. Now, the intensity of what happened during the summer of 2020 was much greater. And yet then, too, we saw that a tragic death was put to political use by the activist left. In 2020, of course, the killing of George Floyd became a cause célèbre, which was used as a political justification to call for the defunding of police, not only in Minneapolis, but around the country. Even though you didn't necessarily have absolute defunding of the police in most places, police certainly were, felt that they were very much under pressure to be more lax in enforcing the law and to give criminals more leeway. Not only did police feel this, but indeed the entire society in America, the entirety of our justice system, judges as well as police officers, all felt as if they had to go more softly and treat criminals a lot more carefully than before the George Floyd incident. And we saw what the result of that was, that after 2020, crime rates, violent crime in particular, within American cities started to skyrocket. And we've had a number of horrific incidents in recent years, which are a result of people who have very extensive criminal histories being released onto the streets by liberal judges, by judges who take a very soft-on-crime view. These criminals are then let go despite having extensive rap sheets, and they go and they commit murders, or they go and they commit other kinds of violent crimes or other crimes of any number of descriptions. We've also seen, of course, that the amount of enforcement of simple things like laws against shoplifting or jumping turnstiles in subways, that these laws are less enforced today than they had been in the past. And if you go into a convenience store today or a pharmacy, you'll often see that things like toothpaste and a washing powder and detergent, all these things are now locked up in glass cases where ordinary customers have to go and ask for a clerk to come by and unlock the case so that they can buy the product. This is done because shoplifting is in many places no longer prosecuted at all. That indeed a shoplifter can simply go in and not only just, try to take a product they can hide in their clothes, but they'll go in there, they will take a shopping cart and they will fill it to the brim with all the things they want to take out of a store, and then they'll just walk out. And store security are very limited in what they can do, and police will do almost nothing in many cases. As a result, a contempt of the law has become a routine feature in much of our youth culture and much of our urban culture in America. But the taproot of this is not necessarily the shoplifters themselves. It certainly isn't necessarily, in the generation of young people who are coming up today. They're not responsible for the world that is allowing them to get away with these things. Rather, these things are now permissible in our society because of decisions being made by older people, by the baby boom generation, by my generation, Generation X, and indeed by adult millennials who are increasingly in positions of power. All of these people, all of these Americans who are older and wiser and should know that the law has to be enforced, are instead taking a sympathetic view of criminals and a very hostile view of law enforcement. We saw during the 2020 riots that the police were constantly blamed for what had happened to George Floyd. Even though George Floyd was resisting arrest, he was someone who had an extensive criminal record. He had in fact committed a crime, and yet he wound up being turned into a kind of secular saint as a result of his death. Renee Good is now being presented as if she were simply a housewife who innocently got involved in this incident with ICE and was slain by ICE for no good reason. Well, of course, all of that is false. This was an activist. Her engagement with ICE was of her own creation, her own, she was the one who took the initiative to become directly involved with ICE in the first place as a protester, as someone trying to interfere with their ability to carry out their job. Now, keep in mind, when an activist who has been trained in a number of things, from blowing whistles in order to alert criminal illegal immigrants that ICE is coming to arrest them, to, for example, using her vehicle to try to obstruct ICE or trying to interfere with the enforcement of the law, these things create dangerous situations for ICE agents. Renee Good's widow said, well, we had whistles and they had guns, referring to the ICE agents. Well, there's a reason why law enforcement agents carry guns. It's because their job is very dangerous. And when ICE agents encounter gang members, when they encounter folks from Tren de Aragua, one of these extremely violent Venezuelan gangs that is now in America as a result of our very loose border policy, these agents are fearing for their lives. And in fact, the agent who shot Renee Good had previously been dragged from a car just a year or two earlier. So these agents have experience with violence. They are facing, the potential that they could be killed any day of the week when they are enforcing the law. And they're enforcing the law, of course, because America has decided it wants to have enforcement of our border laws. We had an election. We had a presidential candidate by the name of Donald Trump in 2024 who made it very clear that enforcing the immigration laws would be a top priority. And indeed, it was a priority that the voters who put Donald Trump back in office in 2024 expected him to carry out. They expected him to be faithful on that commitment. Well, now, you have cadres of left-wing activists in cities like Minneapolis, Portland, and elsewhere who are trying to frustrate the will of the American people, who are basically attacking American democracy. They are attacking the rule of law. They are attacking the constitutional order under which these laws restricting immigration have been passed, and they are trying to impede law enforcement. They are trying to reverse the results of the 2024 election, and they're trying to restore us to a anarchic open borders situation that we had under Joe Biden. Biden was very lax in enforcing immigration law, and you had enormous numbers of illegal immigrants come into this country, many of whom are violent criminals. Donald Trump has been trying to reverse this, and yet you have unelected activists in cities like Minneapolis who are trying to negate an election. They're trying to negate the law. This is a revolutionary situation. It's not necessarily the most violent revolutionary situation. We don't have these activists taking up arms trying to attack ICE yet. But it certainly is an attempt to create a much more dangerous environment for ICE agents. It's trying to alert criminals who may want to then attack them, and it's trying to involve ICE in traffic incidents that have the potential to turn deadly. Deadly not only for ICE agents, but also for bystanders, and of course, potentially for the activists who are orchestrating these events in the first place. And that's exactly what happened to Renee Good. She was someone who was trying to interfere with law enforcement. That created a dangerous situation. It was a dangerous situation that threatened the life of an ICE agent, and it was a dangerous situation that ultimately led Renee Good herself to lose her life. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and if you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button and share this video with your friends. You can also find Modern Age online at www.modernAgeJournal.com. On our website, we have new content every day, and you can also read our print magazine, which has been going since 1957, and it's published every 3 months. Within it, you will find some of the deepest conservative thought in any publication around. Modern Age was founded by, indeed, the man who popularized the idea of a serious intellectual conservative tradition in America back in the 1950s. Russell Kirk, with The Conservative Mind, the book he published in 1953, really kicked off the conservative intellectual renaissance in America, and Modern Age was the journal he founded in 1957. Today, you can follow our ideas online here with my videos. You can follow them at modernAgeJournal.com, and of course, we are still in print as well. Now, the left-wing organizations that go and train the activists to engage in this kind of interference with law enforcement in the streets of cities like Minneapolis and Portland and all across the country, these organizations are not necessarily inconvenienced when one of their activists gets killed. On the contrary, these organizations very cynically took advantage of the tragedy of George Floyd's death in 2020 in order to push an agenda against law enforcement and against law itself. And they very effectively tried, first of all, to defund police departments, but even if they didn't succeed in getting all the way to defunding police, they succeeded in making the police much more timid about enforcing the law and in sending a signal to the justice system and to judges that it was okay to treat criminals leniently. So that was a great success for those who support criminals and who do not want to see law enforced. That was a success based upon the use to which activists and ideologues were able to put the death of George Floyd. Well, the death of Renee Good presents the same opportunity for left-wing activists and ideologues in the year 2026. This is now an opportunity for them to take their hostility towards ICE, which has already been very intense, and use this now to kind of whip up, protests in cities across America, particularly, of course, in Minneapolis, and to try to demonize ICE, to present ICE as, a reckless, dangerous police force, and to try to get ICE defunded, abolished, or at the very least restricted and intimidated. Now, President Trump doesn't seem to be giving into this. He's actually sending more ICE agents into cities like Minneapolis. One of the reasons that, by the way, these progressive cities like Minneapolis and Portland are so dangerous for ICE agents is precisely because the left-wing leadership in those cities tries to impede law enforcement as well. They say that local police, for example, are not allowed to cooperate with ICE. Well, that only creates a more dangerous situation for everyone, for, citizens in cities like Minneapolis, for law enforcement of Minneapolis itself, and for ICE agents. Left-wing activists take advantage of all of this tension and all of these difficulties in order to exacerbate and to try to worsen the situation as much as possible, precisely in the hopes that something tragic will happen, because they will then use the tragedy in order to further besmirch law enforcement and to try to get ICE restricted, if not abolished. This is a war on the rule of law. It's being conducted through passive-aggressive techniques that are adapted from the idea of, various kinds of resistance movements, various kinds of things that are not necessarily, again, taking up classic, sort of armed revolutionary tactics, but are instead trying to subvert the rule of law and the democratic process using civil disobedience. It is a terrible threat not only to our rule of law, not only to democracy, not only to the idea that we are going to have law enforcement in this country and we're not simply going to let criminals walk around and be, able to take advantage of ordinary citizens and impose their will on whomever they like. It's a danger to people's lives as well. And yet again, there is a perverse incentive for these left-wing groups to actually create more dangerous situations in which someone will lose their life, whether it's an ICE agent or a bystander or an activist themselves. And this situation, this tragedy, will then be politically weaponized by the activist ideological left, the radicals, in order to demonize law enforcement. And unfortunately, it works. It worked in 2020, and current polling suggests that it's working in 2026. Now, American voters did find themselves disgusted by the consequences of the new policies that were put in place after the death of George Floyd in 2020. American voters in the 2022 midterm elections, and then even more in the 2024 presidential election, they objected to the new freewheeling environment for criminals, for legal immigrants, but also for violent domestic criminals as well, that allowed them to run rampant under Joe Biden, under a much more lax regime of policing, especially policing of immigration laws. Americans saw the consequences in escalating crime rates within their neighborhoods. They were ashamed to see people were being murdered by criminals who had extensive rap sheets who should never have been out on the streets in the first place. And of course, police, feeling intimidated by all the political pressure that was put upon them, became less effective. They became less aggressive in pursuing the enforcement of the law. And you want police to be forceful. It is not the case. You will often find that there are very confused people, some of whom are libertarians, some of whom might be very sort of squishy, wishy-washy kinds of conservatives, who will say, well, the police shouldn't have any kind of special authority to give a person an order or to try to enforce the law. They behave as if police, if anything, are under a greater degree of suspicion than the criminals are when it comes to the use of force. That's not the case. Police have to have a presumption of being able to use force to enforce the law. Otherwise, the law is a dead letter. But not only is the law a dead letter, there actually will be a law. It simply will not be the laws that we pass as a people. They will not be laws that originate in the democratic process. Instead, they will be the laws of the jungle that are imposed and enforced by criminals. And of course, that's a situation that too many Americans had to live under in the Joe Biden years. And as a result, they politically rejected that. But now we find that many people do not have the strength of character to look at these tragic incidents, whether it's George Floyd or Renee Good, and to say that, in fact, law enforcement was doing the right thing. And we can have trials, we can look at particular details of these cases and say perhaps law enforcement, went a little too far or did something that was outside of the norms of regulations. But there should certainly be a presumption that when someone is trying to provoke a terrible situation with ICE, that the ICE agents should not be simply routinely dismissed as creating danger to civilians. On the contrary, they were doing everything possible to avoid the likes of Renee Good. They were doing everything possible to try to discourage people from getting involved in the enforcement of the law. This is something that police should be handling, that ICE should be handling. It's not something where you should have left-wing activists interjecting themselves and interposing themselves in situations that create greater danger for themselves, for bystanders, for ICE as well. By the way, it's quite interesting that around the same time as the Renee Good tragedy, there was a shooting in Portland. An ICE officer shot two people in a car, both of whom survived, in a car that was trying to run him down. So it looked like a very similar incident to what happened in Minneapolis. And indeed, on social media, you saw a number of progressive activists coming forward and trying to turn the Portland incident into another rallying, cause, just as they did with the Minneapolis tragedy. It didn't work, however, because the two persons, the illegal immigrants who were shot by an ICE agent in this Portland incident, were both members of Tren de Aragua, or at least had connections to Tren de Aragua. And there was a rather, sort of tragicomic scene in Portland where a Portland chief of police came out and he admitted, oh yes, these two illegal immigrants, they actually do have Tren de Aragua connections. And yet he was breaking out in tears and saying, oh, it's so terrible, this is blaming the victims. Illegal immigrants who are part of a violent gang are not victims. If they get shot while they are committing a crime, that is entirely just and entirely appropriate. And it's precisely what you want law enforcement doing. That if law enforcement is being threatened by criminals, you want them to use force to stop the criminals. You do not want them to simply let the criminals run them over, let the criminals get away with their crimes. That's what leads to, a situation where you have, not just police, but also ordinary citizens being victimized by people who will get on the subway and plunge a knife into their necks, by people who will set them on fire, if you are a traveler on the subway, by people who will, import foreign criminal gangs, bringing drugs and, using, violence to enforce their territory. All of this is a result of simply not putting proper authority in the hands of law enforcement. And again, there are many people, including some very confused libertarians, who think that it is somehow a good idea if we say that left-wing activists are to be, sort of cherished and valued as, great citizens, and police, on the other hand, are to be looked at with suspicion because, why should they have the use of force on their side? Aren't all Americans supposed to be equal? In which case, the police having the greater authority to use force, that would be a violation of equality in the minds of both leftists and certain libertarians. There is this movement on the part of certain people who think of themselves as libertarians to disempower police, which has the corollary effect of empowering these left-wing activists who try to create situations that will embarrass and ultimately be used to try to discredit police. It empowers left-wing activists, and of course, it also empowers criminals. And once again, the situation you get to is not a situation of equality. It's not that, every citizen can now go around and, police are presumptively in the wrong if they approach the citizen for any reason. No, you get to a situation where, in fact, there is inequality, but now police have the least amount of, respect and authority. Left-wing activists have a somewhat greater degree of respect and authority. But of course, the people who have a carte blanche to use violence then become the criminals, because the criminals know that the police are going to be in a very difficult position when it comes to trying to enforce the law. And so criminals actually become the people who set the tempo of society, who set the texture of society, and who, put basically all citizens in a position of having to feel defensive, having to feel afraid, having to feel terrorized. This is exactly the sort of feeling that people have when they live in totalitarian countries. It's the kind of feeling people have, in fact, when they live under fascism. Remember, fascism gets started not as a legal police force. Fascism gets started as street thugs going around and beating up people they disagree with. In other words, you have a beginning of fascism, whether it's in Nazi Germany or whether it's in Mussolini's Italy, when you have these paramilitary forces, these basically private organized crime forces that are, anti-socialist. They might be politically on the right, they might be political, but they do not have legitimate state authority. They are simply thugs going around using violence to impose their will. This is precisely the kind of situation that our progressive activists, for all their claims of talking about freedom and equality and justice for the oppressed, they're actually bringing about a situation where thugs in our cities are, treated like aristocrats, where they have the authority to go in, they can march into a shop, they can take whatever they want. Security within the shops are not allowed to interfere with them and stop them. The police are intimidated. The police wind up, staying in their precincts because if they go out, they're going to be stalked, they're going to be harassed by Antifa and by left-wing activists, and instead you have criminals who can go out and impose their will thuggishly. The only thing that really separates the criminals who are given lenient treatment, whether they are Tren de Aragua gangbangers who have connections to violence in Venezuela, or whether they are just Americans, who may have, severe mental issues or who may have, kind of racist hatred towards white people. These street criminals or Tren de Aragua organized criminals, they may not have a focused political agenda, the way that black shirts and brown shirts had in, Weimar Germany and in Italy before the fascist takeover. But in most other respects, they are very similar. These are thugs. And when you let thugs get away with running your society, you have a society that is ultimately headed towards totalitarianism. And again, it's not just because you might have a compensating, massive crackdown. It's rather the opposite, that you wind up with people feeling so insecure that they do not have the capacity for freedom. They do not have the capacity to act as citizens who feel safe and self-responsible. Instead, they cower. They retreat behind gated communities, or, if you are a business, you wind up locking up all of your detergent, all of your toothpaste, all kinds of goods behind, cabinets that have to be accessed by a clerk. All of this in order to accommodate criminals. All of this in order to make, criminals feel more comfortable, and in order to defer to the moral authority that is being usurped by left-wing activists like Renee Good. This is authority that no one has entrusted to them. They have not been elected. They have not been given the, legitimate democratic power to make laws. They do not have any kind of office under the Constitution. And yet they feel that they can go and create situations that will be dangerous, and that because the American people have lost their nerve, the American people will then blame law enforcement if something tragic happens, as indeed happened to Renee Good. What we need in this country is a very firm reassertion of the rule of law. That means that when we have elections and laws are passed, that those laws are going to be enforced, and that law enforcement agents will be treated with respect and a certain degree of deference. It does not mean that law enforcement has carte blanche. On the contrary, when you have a situation where law enforcement are treated with respect, you have a situation where you may in fact have a much, better reciprocal understanding between police and citizens. Whereas what you have currently, you see the left will often, make a great deal of hype about the fact that ICE agents are often masked. Is this because ICE agents want to be, violent, towards ordinary citizens? No, it's because ICE agents are systematically harassed by left-wing activists who will identify these individuals and will then organize protests outside their homes, or will otherwise try to make their personal lives miserable. And of course, we've seen left-wing activists do this to everyone they possibly can. They've tried to do it even with Supreme Court justices. The left really does believe in personal harassment, again, as a kind of extra-constitutional assertion of authority and power, and an imposition of a kind of law of the jungle or a law of left-wing activists, not only on ordinary citizens, but on law enforcement officers, ultimately even on Supreme Court justices. They've tried it with the vice president, too. They have, had their protesters. Often, of course, these are paid protesters. This is not a spontaneous popular phenomenon. These protests are very often, involve professionals who are paid by nonprofit organizations that have connections and are funded by George Soros or any number of other radical left-wing billionaires. This is all basically a situation that bears a very close resemblance to what's called racketeering, yes? When you have people who are organizing in order to subvert the law, that is generally something that is covered by racketeering laws. That if the mob, for example, is using its capacities as organized crime, not just street crime, but actual organized crime, in order to try to protect its criminal mafiosi as they, are arrested or, threatened by the law, when you use the power of organization to support criminal activity, that's racketeering. And it seems like there's an awful lot of something that's very close to racketeering. If it's certainly the moral equivalent of racketeering, and it may even meet the legal definition of racketeering, when we look at how the left organizes to demonize and discredit and defund police, whether it's police departments in cities like Minneapolis, or whether it's ICE, the agency that's charged with enforcing our customs and immigration laws. You have activist organizations which use a playbook, they use training, they use tactics, they try to create dangerous situation. They try to personally intimidate ICE agents, judges, Supreme Court justices, the vice president, anyone they possibly can. Anyone who's opposed to them will have protesters target them and will, use harassment of various kinds. They'll send them anonymous death threats over social media. There's a whole panoply of tactics that is deployed by the left to try to intimidate anyone who is on the side of the rule of law. The left does all of this, and it is luxuriously bankrolled by billionaires like George Soros. And this is, again, an attack upon constitutional government. It's an attack upon rule of law. for all of the nonsense that you hear leftists constantly spout about democracy and protecting democracy, they are actually the ones who are most systematically attacking and trying to subvert democracy. They're trying to, basically sabotage the rule of law by saying that laws cannot be enforced and by saying that criminals have greater privilege than ordinary citizens or police officers. All of this is being done, at the behest and with the support of billionaires. It's a really remarkable situation. And obviously, there is indeed a political agenda here that is very wide-reaching and that has devastating implications for the lives and safety and freedom of ordinary American citizens. This is something that, it seems to me, some of the people who reflexively, who are not necessarily leftists, but who reflexively want to blame law enforcement if a George Floyd or a Renee Good dies in the course of an altercation with law enforcement, these people who reflexively blame the police need to think very carefully about what the implications are of basically submitting to the left-wing ideologues framing of these incidents and the tactics that left-wingers often use to set up these incidents in the first place. Certainly in the case of Renee Good, in the case of George Floyd and many of the other, cases that have been exploited by Black Lives Matter and other left-wing activist groups, they are taking advantage of the fact that a lot of individuals, in America's cities, including a number of African-American individuals, have been basically taught, well, look, if you're poor, if you are a racial minority, then basically society has oppressed you, and you may behave in a certain lordly fashion towards, 7-Eleven owners or towards police officers, that basically the law should not apply to you because of the historic injustices that your category of citizens may have experienced. And therefore, and also, you listen to enough, popular culture of various kinds, whether it's television, whether it's, certain kinds of popular music. And it's always valorizing the criminal. It's always valorizing the guy who resists the law. And you also start to breed a culture of contempt for authority and a culture of, there's this term that the left uses called toxic masculinity, where basically they're blaming men for being responsible. They're blaming men for being competent. Anything that is historically masculine and virtuous, the left really dislikes. But the left celebrates the idea of men being emotional and men being, unable to exhibit self-control. Self-control, in fact, is probably the most toxic of all the qualities that the left, demonizes in men. That's what they mean by toxic masculinity. But actually, the left is constantly trying to tell young men, hey, you should be defiant of law enforcement officers. You should behave as if, especially if you are of a minority, that justice is automatically on your side because of your oppressed status, and it is against law enforcement or anyone who tells you that you should basically behave like a civilized human being and not behave like a thug. Well, as a result, you have individuals who go out and behave in ways where when they're breaking the law, they feel as if they are entitled. They feel as if they have a right not only to break the law, but also to resist arrest. And almost all of the situations that Black Lives Matter exploited involved individuals who were resisting legitimate arrest. They were individuals who'd committed crimes or were in the act of committing crimes. Police tried to prevent those crimes, tried to arrest them, and these individuals resisted arrest, and then that escalated to the point where police had to use force, and in many cases, this was lethal force. Again, if you endorse the idea that there is a right to resist arrest, the result is you're going to have a much more violent society, and you're going to have criminals who are wielding that violence rather than police officers. It is a sad commentary perhaps on human nature, that we are all fallen and sinful, imperfect beings, that police do indeed have to use force, they have to use violence, but that's the acknowledgement of reality. And there's a reason why we have the organization under law and accountable to the democratic political process and accountable to the Constitution. There's a reason that we organize violence in the form of the armed forces and law enforcement agencies, rather than saying the violence in our society is going to be monopolized or is going to be the privilege of people who are totally outside the law, people who are criminals, people who feel as if they are personally entitled to force others to submit to their demands, to give up their persons, their property, and even their lives because a criminal has decided that he wants to take something to which he is not entitled. It is absolutely vital that if America is going to get back to being a more peaceful and orderly society, that the American public as a whole understands this and that they act accordingly in elections. It's important that judges and even Supreme Court justices understand just what is happening when you have these left-wing activists who are systematically dismantling the enforcement of law in this country and who are, using intimidation tactics in order to get their way. Judges have to be much more strict about imposing harsh sentences, not only on criminals who have extensive rap sheets and who, if released into society, will commit crimes again and might ultimately escalate those crimes to violence and indeed murder. It's not just those individuals who have to be kept in jail. It's also left-wing activists, maybe they call themselves protesters, but if they break the law, they should not be given a slap on the wrist. They should not be treated leniently. They should be seen as organized subversives who are trying to create a violent and dangerous situation for ordinary American citizens and for law enforcement. And these people should be given very tough sentences. Now, that's not to say the sentences should be absolutely ludicrous, but they certainly should not be a slap on the wrist. This should be enough time in prison that it actually deters these protesters from breaking the law and using intimidation tactics routinely. Now, the left will often say, hey, how can conservatives criticize these left-wing activists who are using intimidation tactics and using protests that are designed to impede the enforcement of the law? Well, gee, didn't you have the January 6th protest at the U.S. Capitol in 2021, where you had a number of Donald Trump supporters invade the U.S. Capitol in a lawless fashion and try to intimidate Congress, try to intimidate Vice President Pence, as you had the process of the counting of the electoral vote, the certification of the electoral college vote taking place. But of course, that was not organized. And despite the left, having various conspiracy theories, obviously, if you had that mass of people invading the Capitol in 2001, and they had been racketeering and they had been organized, they actually would have succeeded in their effort because their numbers completely overwhelmed the inadequate Capitol Police presence, which Nancy Pelosi had provided for that occasion. And conservatives are rightly critical of Nancy Pelosi, who was in charge of Congress and, had responsibility for giving orders to Capitol Police. Basically, the Democrats did everything they could to minimize the presence of law enforcement during January 6, 2021. Again, precisely because they were hoping that you might get some sort of incident that would then backfire and embarrass President Trump. So President Trump, who had called for a peaceful protest, wound up being put in a very difficult position by these protesters who decided to become not just protesters, but actual rioters at the U.S. Capitol. But again, it was quite different from the kind of organized, rioting and protesting that you find from the left. And the left, of course, systematically does this nationwide, not just, as part of a feverish, overexcited political protest of what supporters of Donald Trump sincerely believed was a stolen election. And indeed, since 2020, an awful lot of information has come out that, in fact, maybe in some places you actually did have illegal immigrants, for example, on voter rolls. And maybe, in fact, you did have some voting machines and some ballots that were being counted in improper ways that weren't properly postmarked. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the, claims about the election being stolen in 2020 were correct. But it certainly does lend weight to the idea that there should have been a much closer scrutiny of what had happened in that election, particularly in places like Georgia, than actually took place. And President Trump, of course, at the time, was simply calling on Georgia election officials to do more recounts and to take a closer look at what had happened. The fact that Georgia election officials refused to do that is not a sign that they had clean consciences. It was a sign, rather, that they were afraid that if they actually did do recounts and did take a closer look at what had happened in places like DeKalb County, they would have discovered things that would have been irregular and that would have raised the question that perhaps those irregularities affected the outcome of the 2020 election. All of that said, It is ridiculous for the left to try to use January 6th as an excuse for their abuses in the year 2026 when it comes to, deploying activists who engage in harassment, engage in interference with police, who take the side of criminals, who try to alert criminals to evade police, and who put police, including ICE law enforcement, in dangerous situations that, again, have the potential to spiral out of control, not only costing the lives of immigration enforcement officers, but also potentially bystanders, and of course, activists themselves like Renee Good. In America, we need to have respect for the law, respect for law enforcement, and a strict application of the law and law enforcement to people who try to subvert the law and people who are committing crimes.